The silence in Bancroft Hall was deafening, broken only by the sharp click of dress shoes against polished marble. 2,000 midshipmen stood at attention, their white uniforms pristine under the cathedral lighting, while families filled the gallery above. But none of that mattered to me in this moment. What mattered was the Admiral walking directly toward me, his face grave with purpose, while my sister Vanessa sat frozen in her seat, her mouth slightly open in dawning horror. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. He stopped 3 feet away and spoke words that would shatter everything my family thought they knew about me. Colonel Morrison, on behalf of the United States Naval Academy and the Department of Defense, we have a presentation to make. The title hung in the air like a thunderclap. Not Captain Morrison, my sister's bitter nickname for my failed military career. Not the washout she'd spent 15 years telling everyone I was. Colonel Morrison. I watched Vanessa's face drain of color as the Admiral continued, his voice carrying across the vast hall. Your classified service record has been partially declassified for today's ceremony. The Academy wishes to recognize the extraordinary sacrifice and dedication of someone who has shaped the future of naval intelligence. He paused, looking directly at my nephew Marcus, who stood at attention with his graduating class, his eyes wide with shock. Someone who has been quietly protecting this nation's interests while remaining in the shadows for the greater good. The morning had started so differently, with Vanessa's familiar contempt disguised as concern. We were sitting in the hotel restaurant, picking at overpriced Eggs Benedict while she delivered what I'd come to recognize as her signature lecture about my life choices. The Naval Academy graduation was in 3 hours, and she was using every minute to remind me why I didn't belong there. I just don't understand why you're even here, Celeste, she said, not bothering to lower her voice despite the crowded dining room. Marcus barely knows you. You've missed every important moment in his life because you were off playing soldier in some desert somewhere. She paused to sip her mimosa, her eyes calculating. Honestly, I think your whole military phase damaged you. You came back wrong, different, like you couldn't figure out how to live in the real world anymore. I kept my expression neutral, a skill I'd perfected over 2 decades of family gatherings. Vanessa had always been beautiful in that effortless way that opened doors and made people want to please her. She was the sister who married her college sweetheart, lived in the perfect suburban house with the perfect lawn, and raised children who excelled at everything they touched. I was the sister who'd enlisted at 18 and spent the next 22 years in places that didn't exist on any map my family had ever seen. Marcus invited me, I said simply, cutting into my eggs with surgical precision. I wouldn't miss his graduation. Vanessa laughed, but there was no humor in it. Right, because you've been such a present aunt. When was the last time you even called him? Last Christmas? His birthday? She leaned forward, her voice dropping to that confidential tone she used when delivering her cruelest observations. You know what he told me last month? He said he didn't even know what to tell his friends about his aunt, the weird one who shows up every few years with stories about places no one's ever heard of and then disappears again. The words stung because they contained enough truth to cut deep. I had missed birthdays, holidays, school plays, and soccer games. I'd sent gifts from overseas, made brief phone calls when operational security allowed, and maintained the careful distance that kept my family safe. They'd never known why, because they'd never been cleared to know why. I've been serving my country, I said, the same response I'd given for over 2 decades. Serving your country, Vanessa repeated mockingly. God, you still say that like it means something, like it justifies everything? She gestured around the elegant hotel restaurant, where other families were sharing excited conversations about the ceremony ahead. Look around, Celeste. These are real families, people who show up, people who prioritize the people they love over some abstract notion of duty to strangers. I watched her face as she spoke, noting the genuine frustration beneath the cruelty. Vanessa wasn't evil, just limited. She lived in a world where love was measured in presence, where sacrifice meant giving up your weekend plans for your child's recital. She had no framework for understanding a world where love sometimes meant staying away, where the greatest service was the kind that could never be acknowledged. Marcus is graduating today because of sacrifices I made that you'll never understand, I said quietly. More cryptic soldier talk. You know what Marcus needed? He needed an aunt who showed up to his high school graduation. He needed someone who knew his girlfriend's name without being reminded. He needed family who chose him over whatever shadow games you've been playing all these years. The shadow games. If she only knew. If she had any idea what those shadow games had prevented, what threats had been neutralized while she was organizing neighborhood book clubs and planning charity galas. But that was the point, wasn't it? She got to live in her safe, predictable world precisely because people like me operated in the shadows. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Aunt Celeste, are you still coming today? I know Mom thinks you're weird, but it would mean a lot to me if you were there. The message was followed by 3 more. I've been telling my roommate about your stories, the ones about traveling the world. He thinks it's cool that I have an aunt who's seen so much. Then, I know you and Mom don't get along, but today isn't about her. It's about me, and I want you there. I showed the messages to Vanessa, watching her face tighten with irritation. He's being polite, she said dismissively. Marcus is too kind to tell you how little your presence means after all these years of absence. But I knew my nephew better than she gave me credit for.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
During my brief visits home, usually when I was between assignments and had a few weeks of leave, Marcus had always sought me out. He'd been the kid who sat quietly in the corner while the adults talked, absorbing everything with intelligent eyes. When I told stories about my travels, carefully edited versions that removed any classified details, he'd listened with rapt attention while his siblings played video games. He'd been 12 the last time I'd been home for an extended period, recovering from what the family thought was a training accident, but was actually a knife wound from a close encounter with a human trafficker in Southeast Asia. Marcus had noticed the way I favored my left side, the careful way I moved, and he'd asked direct questions that showed a maturity beyond his years. "Does it hurt when you walk?" he'd asked one evening when we were alone on the back porch. "A little," I'd admitted. "Is that why you're really here? Because you got hurt wherever you were?" I'd looked at him then, this serious boy with his father's steady gaze and his mother's sharp intelligence, and made a decision that went against every protocol I'd been trained to follow. "Yes," I said simply. "Were you helping people?" "I was trying to." He'd nodded, accepting the incomplete answer with the wisdom of a child who understood that some truths were too big for simple explanations. "I'm glad you're okay," he said. "I'm glad you came home." That conversation had sustained me through 6 more years of deployments, through missions that couldn't be discussed and victories that couldn't be celebrated. Marcus had seen me, really seen me, in a way that the rest of my family never had. He'd understood instinctively that there was more to my story than the surface narrative of a career soldier who'd chosen duty over family. Now he was graduating from the Naval Academy, following a path that would lead him into the same world of service that had defined my adult life. Vanessa saw it as validation of her belief that I'd somehow infected her son with my unhealthy obsession with military life. I saw it as the natural result of a young man who'd grown up understanding that some things were worth fighting for. The graduation ceremony was everything the Academy promised it would be. The pageantry was flawless, the precision of the midshipmen's movements was breathtaking, and the sense of tradition was overwhelming. I sat in the family section wearing my civilian clothes, a simple navy blue dress that wouldn't draw attention, while Vanessa sat beside me in designer everything, her pride in Marcus warring with her fundamental disapproval of the institution he was joining. "I still can't believe he chose this," she murmured as we watched the graduating class march onto the field in perfect formation. 4 years of this rigid military nonsense when he could have gone to Stanford like his father wanted. "He chose to serve," I said, my eyes finding Marcus in the sea of white uniforms. He looked older, more mature, the boy I'd known transformed into a young officer ready to take on the world. "He chose to throw away his potential," Vanessa countered, "just like you did." I was about to respond when the Academy superintendent took the podium and began speaking about tradition, service, and sacrifice. The words washed over me like a familiar song, concepts I'd lived but never been able to adequately explain to my family. As he spoke, I noticed movement among the senior staff, admirals and captains conferring quietly at the edge of the ceremony space. Then I saw him, Admiral Richardson, a man I'd briefed just 6 months earlier in a secure facility outside Washington, D.C. He was scanning the crowd, his eyes methodical and purposeful. When his gaze met mine, he nodded almost imperceptibly and began making his way through the seated families. My blood went cold. This was unprecedented. Whatever was happening, it was going to expose everything I'd worked to keep hidden. My family didn't know about my security clearance, my real rank, or the nature of my service. They thought I was a career enlisted soldier who'd never amounted to much, someone who'd chosen the military because she couldn't hack it in the real world. Admiral Richardson stopped at the end of my row and spoke quietly to an aide, who then approached me with military precision. "Ma'am, could you please come with me? The Admiral would like a word." Vanessa looked confused and slightly annoyed. "What's this about? We're in the middle of the ceremony." The aide looked at her with the kind of polite deference that military personnel perfected when dealing with civilians. "Ma'am, this concerns Colonel Morrison. If you could excuse us for just a moment." The title hung in the air like a live grenade. Colonel Morrison. Not Celeste, not Miss Morrison, not even Captain, as Vanessa had mockingly called me for years. Colonel Morrison. I saw the exact moment the words registered in Vanessa's mind. Her face went through a series of expressions, confusion, disbelief, and then a dawning horror as the implications began to sink in. She'd spent 15 years telling everyone who would listen that her sister was a career enlisted soldier who'd never been promoted beyond sergeant, someone who joined the military because she couldn't hack it in the real world. "There's been some mistake," she said quickly, her voice rising slightly. "My sister isn't a colonel. She's never been an officer. She enlisted right out of high school and has been an enlisted soldier her entire career." The aide looked at me with barely concealed respect, waiting for direction. I could have corrected the misunderstanding quietly, pulled him aside, and explained that my family wasn't cleared for this information. I could have maintained the careful fiction that had protected them for over 2 decades. Instead, I stood up. "Lead the way," I said simply. As I walked away from my seat, leaving Vanessa staring after me in stunned silence, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Not satisfaction exactly, but a kind of relief. The weight of the dual existence I'd been living was finally beginning to lift. Admiral Richardson was waiting near the platform where the Academy leadership was seated. As I approached, he extended his hand with genuine warmth, the kind of greeting reserved for respected colleagues rather than subordinate personnel. "Colonel Morrison," he said, his voice carrying easily in the vast space, "thank you for being here today. I know your nephew means a great deal to you." "Admiral Richardson," I replied, accepting his handshake. "I wouldn't have missed this." He glanced toward the family section, where I could see Vanessa leaning forward in her seat, straining to hear our conversation. "I understand your family isn't fully briefed on your service record." "That's correct, sir. For operational security reasons, they've been told I was enlisted personnel with a standard deployment rotation." He nodded, understanding immediately. "Well, that's about to change. The Secretary of Defense has decided that your contributions to national security warrant public recognition, and today seems like the perfect venue." He paused, studying my face. "Are you prepared for that level of exposure?" I thought about Marcus, standing at attention with his graduating class, about to begin his own journey into military service. I thought about Vanessa's years of condescending lectures about my failed life choices, her certainty that I'd chosen the military because I couldn't succeed at anything else. I thought about the missions I couldn't discuss, the lives I'd helped save, the threats I'd helped neutralize while my family slept safely in their suburban beds. Yes, sir, I'm ready. What happened next would become the stuff of family legend, though not in the way Vanessa had always imagined. Admiral Richardson walked to the podium and requested permission from the superintendent to address the graduating class and their families. The ceremony paused as he took the microphone, his presence commanding immediate attention from the 2,000 midshipmen and their assembled families. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying clearly across the vast space, Today, we celebrate not just the achievements of these outstanding young officers, but the tradition of service that spans generations. It's that tradition that brings me to the podium with a special recognition. I could see Marcus in the formation, his posture perfect, but his eyes searching the crowd, probably wondering what was happening to disrupt the carefully choreographed ceremony. Among our guests today is a woman whose service to this nation has been exemplary, though necessarily conducted in the shadows. Her contributions to naval intelligence have been so significant that the Secretary of Defense has authorized the partial declassification of her service record for today's ceremony. The murmur that rippled through the crowd was audible, families leaning forward with curiosity while the midshipmen maintained their rigid attention. Colonel Celeste Morrison has spent the past 22 years serving in the most sensitive intelligence roles our nation can offer. Her work has prevented terrorist attacks, disrupted enemy networks, and provided crucial intelligence that has kept American service members safe around the world. I felt every eye in Bancroft Hall turn toward me, but the only ones that mattered were Vanessa's. She was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before, a mixture of shock, disbelief, and something that might have been fear. Colonel Morrison's nephew, Midshipman Marcus Chen, is graduating today with distinction, following in his aunt's tradition of service. It seems appropriate that we take this moment to honor the woman whose sacrifice and dedication exemplify the highest ideals of military service. As the Admiral continued speaking, I walked toward the platform where Marcus stood with his class. The crowd parted before me, families stepping aside with whispered conversations and curious glances. But I only had eyes for my nephew, who was staring at me with an expression of dawning understanding. When I reached the edge of the formation, Admiral Richardson's aide approached me with a small wooden case. Inside was something I'd never expected to see in public: the Defense Distinguished Service Medal, one of the highest decorations the military could bestow. Colonel Morrison, the Admiral continued from the podium, your classified service record shows numerous commendations, including 3 Bronze Stars, 2 Defense Meritorious Service Medals, and the Defense Distinguished Service Medal being presented today. More importantly, your dedication to duty while maintaining operational security has been extraordinary. You've lived a double life for over 2 decades, allowing your family to believe you were a career enlisted soldier rather than reveal your true rank and responsibilities. The silence in Bancroft Hall was complete now, broken only by the Admiral's voice echoing off the stone walls. This kind of sacrifice goes beyond the call of duty. You've allowed your family to misunderstand your service, to question your choices, and even to doubt your success, all to maintain the operational security that kept them safe. Today, we honor not just your professional achievements, but your personal sacrifice. As he spoke these words, I saw Marcus break from his position in the formation and begin walking toward me. It was a breach of protocol that should have resulted in immediate discipline, but none of the senior staff moved to stop him. Instead, they watched as this young officer approached his aunt with tears streaming down his face. When he reached me, Marcus didn't salute or speak. He simply wrapped his arms around me in a fierce embrace that spoke louder than any words could have. "I always knew," he whispered in my ear, his voice thick with emotion. "I always knew there was more to your story. I just didn't know how much more." Over his shoulder, I could see Vanessa rising from her seat, her face pale with shock. She was staring at us with an expression I'd never seen before, as if she were seeing me clearly for the first time in her life. The Admiral's voice continued from the podium, but his words seemed to fade into the background as I held my nephew, feeling the weight of 22 years of secrets finally lifting from my shoulders. Marcus pulled back to look at me, his young face serious with new understanding. "All those stories you told," he said quietly, "the places you'd been, the people you'd helped, they were all real, weren't they? You weren't just traveling, you were on missions." I nodded, unable to speak past the emotion in my throat. "And when you were hurt that time, when you came home to recover, that wasn't a training accident." "No," I said simply, "it wasn't." Marcus looked toward his mother, who was now standing in the aisle, her designer dress and perfect makeup suddenly looking fragile and insubstantial against the backdrop of military precision surrounding us. "She never understood," he said, not as an accusation but a statement of fact. "She couldn't," I replied, "and that was by design.
I needed her to live in a world where the biggest threat was missing a PTA meeting, not wondering if her sister was going to come home alive from places that don't exist on any map. As we spoke, I became aware that the entire ceremony had shifted its focus to this moment. The midshipmen were still at attention, but their eyes were on us. The families in the gallery were leaning forward, straining to hear our conversation. Even the Academy leadership seemed content to let this unprecedented moment play out. Admiral Richardson approached us, the medal case still in his hands. "Midshipman Chen," he said formally, "would you like to do the honors?" Marcus looked at me with questioning eyes, and I nodded. With hands that trembled slightly with emotion, my nephew pinned the Defense Distinguished Service Medal to my dress, his movements careful and reverent. "For distinguished service in a classified capacity," he said quietly, echoing words he'd probably heard at dozens of military ceremonies, but never expected to say to his own family. As he stepped back, the entire graduating class began to applaud. It started slowly, then built to a thunderous ovation that echoed off the walls of Bancroft Hall. The families joined in, though many of them probably didn't fully understand what they were witnessing. Through it all, I kept my eyes on Vanessa, who remained standing in the aisle, her face cycling through emotions too complex to name. When the applause finally died down, Admiral Richardson made one final announcement. "Colonel Morrison has been selected to serve as the keynote speaker at next year's Naval Intelligence Career Day," he said. "Her insights into modern intelligence operations will be invaluable to the next generation of naval officers." As the ceremony resumed its normal course, I walked back toward the family section with Marcus beside me, still in his white uniform but no longer bound by the rigid protocol of the formation. Vanessa waited for us at the end of the row, her face pale but determined. When we reached her, she looked at me for a long moment without speaking. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "I owe you an apology." "No," I said simply, "you don't."
You believed exactly what I needed you to believe. But all those things I said about your career, about you never amounting to anything, about the military ruining your life? Her voice trailed off as the magnitude of her misunderstanding became clear. "Were necessary," I finished for her. "Vanessa, for the past 22 years, I've been involved in operations that required absolute secrecy. The people closest to me had to believe I was nobody special, just another career soldier marking time until retirement. It was the only way to keep you safe." Marcus looked between us, his young face serious with new understanding. "All those times Mom criticized you for missing family events, for not being present enough, you couldn't tell us why you were really absent." I nodded. "There were missions I couldn't discuss, places I couldn't mention, achievements I couldn't share. Every time your mother accused me of choosing strangers over family, I had to let her believe it because the truth would have put you all at risk." Marcus looked between us, his young face serious with new understanding. "All those times Mom criticized you for missing family events, for not being present enough, you couldn't tell us why you were really absent." I nodded. "There were missions I couldn't discuss, places I couldn't mention, achievements I couldn't share. Every time your mother accused me of choosing strangers over family, I had to let her believe it because the truth would have put you all at risk." Vanessa sank into her seat, the weight of 15 years of accumulated guilt settling on her shoulders. "Oh God, Celeste, the things I said to you, the way I talked about your service, your choices, your life. I made you feel like a failure when you were actually protecting you," Marcus finished quietly. "She was protecting all of us." As the ceremony continued around us, the three of us sat in a bubble of new understanding. The pageantry of the graduation seemed less important now than the quiet conversation happening in our row, the careful reconstruction of a family dynamic that had been built on necessary lies. "How do we move forward from this?" Vanessa asked eventually, her voice small and uncertain. I looked at my nephew, resplendent in his white uniform and beginning his own journey into military service, then at my sister, whose perfect world had just been revealed as a carefully maintained illusion. "We tell the truth," I said simply, or at least as much of the truth as we're allowed to tell. The ceremony concluded with the traditional tossing of midshipman hats into the air, a celebration of achievement and new beginnings.
As white caps rained down around us, Marcus turned to me with a smile that reminded me of the curious boy who'd sat on the back porch asking careful questions about my injuries. "So," he said, with a grin that was pure mischief, "does this mean I can finally brag about having a badass aunt?" For the first time in longer than I could remember, I laughed out loud, the sound carrying across Bancroft Hall and mixing with the cheers of 2,000 new naval officers and their families. "Yes," I said, pulling both him and Vanessa into an embrace that felt like coming home after 22 years in the cold. "I think it does." The reception following the graduation ceremony was held in the Academy's historic Memorial Hall, its soaring walls lined with portraits of naval heroes and battle flags from wars spanning 2 centuries. The space hummed with conversation as families celebrated their newly commissioned officers, but I found myself standing apart from the crowd, still processing the seismic shift that had just occurred in my family's understanding of who I was. Vanessa approached me, carrying 2 glasses of champagne, her movements uncertain in a way I'd never seen before. She'd always been the confident one, the sister who knew exactly how to navigate social situations and emerge victorious. Now she looked like someone trying to find her footing on unfamiliar terrain. "I keep replaying every conversation we've had," she said quietly, offering me one of the glasses. "Every argument, every criticism, every time I made you feel small for your choices. And now I'm wondering how you stood it, how you let me say those things when you knew the truth." I accepted the champagne, but didn't drink it, instead watching the golden bubbles rise to the surface in endless streams. Because arguing with you would have meant revealing classified information. Because defending myself would have compromised operational security. Because keeping you angry at me was safer than keeping you proud of me. She flinched at the last statement, understanding its implications immediately. "You mean people might have targeted us if they knew what you really did?" "People did target you," I said simply. "You just never knew it." The color drained from her face. "What do you mean?" I glanced around the crowded reception, noting the exits, the security personnel positioned discreetly around the perimeter, the way certain guests were being subtly monitored by individuals who weren't wearing name tags or family identification. Old habits died hard, and even in this celebratory environment, I couldn't turn off the part of my brain that assessed threats and calculated risks. "Do you remember that break-in at your house 3 years ago? The one where nothing was stolen but your office was ransacked?" Vanessa nodded slowly. "The police said it was probably teenagers looking for electronics or cash. They couldn't explain why someone would go through my filing cabinets and leave my jewelry untouched. They were looking for information about me, financial records, correspondence, anything that might reveal details about my real assignment. The fact that you genuinely knew nothing about my work is probably what saved your life that night." I watched her process this information, saw the moment when she understood that her ignorance hadn't been accidental or cruel, but protective. Her hand trembled slightly as she raised her champagne glass to her lips. "How many times?" she asked. "How many times were we in danger because of what you do?" 7 incidents over the past decade that we know of, I replied matter-of-factly. Electronic surveillance of your phones, background investigations of Marcus and his siblings, at least 3 attempts to recruit people close to you as intelligence assets. None of it ever touched you directly because you had nothing to give them. Marcus appeared beside us, having changed from his dress uniform into civilian clothes, though he still carried himself with the bearing of a newly minted officer. He'd been circulating through the reception, introducing his roommates and classmates to his extended family, but I could see the questions in his eyes, the need to understand the full scope of what had been revealed. "Aunt Celeste," he said, his voice pitched low enough that only we could hear, "that medal you received today, the Defense Distinguished Service Medal, I looked it up on my phone. It's only awarded for exceptionally meritorious service in a position of great responsibility." I nodded, unsurprised by his research. Marcus had always been thorough, the kind of person who needed to understand the complete picture before drawing conclusions. "The citation mentions services rendered in a classified capacity," he continued, "but it doesn't specify what kind of classified work. Intelligence gathering? Counterterrorism? Something else entirely?" Vanessa looked between us, clearly torn between wanting to know more and being terrified of what she might learn. "Maybe we should talk about this somewhere more private," she suggested, glancing around at the crowded reception.
Marcus shook his head. No, I want to understand now. I'm about to begin my own career in naval service, and I need to know what that might mean for my family, what it might cost them. His directness reminded me so much of myself at his age, that hunger for truth regardless of how uncomfortable it might be. I'd been the same way when I'd first enlisted, eager to serve but naive about the personal sacrifices that service would require. Your mother isn't cleared to know the specifics, I said carefully, but I can tell you that my work has primarily focused on preventing threats before they materialize. Intelligence analysis, threat assessment, occasionally more direct intervention when American lives are at stake. The scars, Marcus said suddenly, the ones you tried to hide when you came home that time, those weren't from training accidents. Vanessa's sharp intake of breath was audible. Scars? What scars? Celeste, were you injured in combat? I looked at my nephew, this young man who was about to embark on his own journey into military service, and made a decision that went against every instinct I'd developed over 2 decades of compartmentalized living. Yes, I said simply, multiple times. The physical injuries were always secondary to the psychological ones, though. The hardest part wasn't getting shot or stabbed or blown up. The hardest part was coming home and pretending it never happened. The three of us stood in silence for a moment, the noise of the reception continuing around us while we processed the weight of this admission. Finally, Vanessa spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. How do you forgive someone for 20 years of willful blindness? You don't need forgiveness, I replied. You were exactly as blind as I needed you to be. Every time you criticized my career, every time you made me feel like a failure, you were reinforcing the cover story that kept you safe. You were playing your role perfectly without even knowing there was a role to play. Marcus had been quiet during this exchange, but now he stepped closer, his expression serious. What happens now? Now that the truth is out, at least partially? Does this change your security situation? Does it change ours? It was an excellent question, one that demonstrated the kind of strategic thinking that would serve him well in his naval career. I was proud of him for considering the implications rather than just focusing on the emotional impact of the revelations. The decision to partially declassify my service record wasn't made lightly, I explained. The threats that required complete secrecy have been neutralized or significantly reduced. The operations I was involved in have concluded successfully, and the people who might have used you against me are no longer in positions to do so. Vanessa looked confused. You mean the danger is over? The immediate danger, yes, but Marcus is right to think about the broader implications. My visibility today, the public recognition, it marks a transition in my career. I'm moving from field operations to a teaching role, training the next generation of intelligence officers. It's a natural progression for someone with my experience, and it's also significantly safer for everyone involved. As if summoned by our conversation, Admiral Richardson appeared at our group, his presence commanding immediate attention despite the casual nature of the reception. He nodded respectfully to Vanessa and Marcus before addressing me directly. Colonel Morrison, I hope you don't mind the interruption. I wanted to follow up on our earlier conversation about the teaching position at the Naval War College. The Secretary of the Navy has approved your appointment as the new Director of Advanced Intelligence Studies. It's a significant role, one that will allow you to shape intelligence doctrine for the next generation of naval officers. The weight of this announcement settled over our small group like a blanket. This wasn't just recognition of my past service, it was validation of my future value to the institution. Vanessa looked stunned, while Marcus's face broke into a smile of genuine pride. Congratulations, Colonel, Marcus said formally, then switched to a more personal tone. Congratulations, Aunt Celeste. This is exactly what you deserve. Admiral Richardson smiled at the familial exchange. Your nephew is quite impressive, Colonel. His academic record at the Academy has been exemplary, and his instructors speak very highly of his analytical abilities. I suspect he may follow in your footsteps into intelligence work. That's his choice to make, I replied, though I couldn't hide the pride in my voice. But if he does choose that path, he'll have my full support and guidance. The Admiral excused himself to rejoin his own family, leaving the three of us alone again. Vanessa had been quiet during the exchange, but now she looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Director of Advanced Intelligence Studies? She repeated slowly. That sounds like an important position. It is, I confirmed. It means I'll be training the people who will be protecting American interests around the world. It means my experience won't be wasted, that the knowledge I've gained over 20 years in the field will be passed on to others who can use it. Marcus was practically vibrating with excitement. Does this mean you'll be stationed in Newport permanently? That you'll actually be around for holidays and birthdays and all those normal family things? The hope in his voice was almost painful to hear. He'd grown up with an aunt who appeared sporadically and disappeared just as suddenly, someone who sent postcards from exotic locations but was rarely present for the mundane moments that actually constituted family life. Yes, I said, the word carrying more weight than I'd expected. I'll be based at the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. I'll have a normal schedule, normal leave time, a normal life for the first time in over 2 decades. Vanessa's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment she looked like the sister I'd grown up with rather than the polished suburban matron she'd become. We have so much time to make up for, she said softly. So many conversations we should have had, so many moments we missed.
We have time now, I replied, surprising myself with the gentleness in my voice. We have all the time in the world. The reception continued around us, but our focus had shifted inward to the work of rebuilding relationships that had been necessarily damaged by the requirements of my former life. Marcus excused himself to rejoin his classmates, but not before extracting a promise that I would attend his commissioning ceremony the following week. Vanessa and I found ourselves alone for the first time since the morning's revelations, standing near one of the great windows that looked out over the Severn River. The afternoon light painted everything in golden tones, and for the first time in years, I felt something approaching peace. I have a confession to make, Vanessa said, her voice barely audible over the noise of the reception. I was jealous of you. I looked at her in surprise. Vanessa had everything I'd supposedly wanted: the husband, the children, the beautiful home, the social status that came with being the successful sister. Jealous of what? I asked. Of your certainty, she replied. You always knew exactly what you wanted to do with your life. You enlisted at 18 without a moment's hesitation, and you never looked back. You never second-guessed yourself or wondered if you'd made the right choice. You had this sense of purpose that I never understood but always envied. I considered her words carefully before responding. I looked back constantly. Every missed birthday, every holiday I couldn't attend, every phone call that ended too quickly because I couldn't explain where I was or what I was doing. I questioned my choices every single day. But you never wavered, she pressed. You never came home and announced you were quitting, getting out, choosing a normal life instead. You stuck with it even when it cost you everything. It didn't cost me everything, I said quietly. It cost me some things, important things, but it didn't cost me everything. And the things I gained, the lives I was able to protect, the threats I was able to neutralize, those had to count for something. Vanessa nodded slowly, beginning to understand the calculus that had governed my adult life. But how do you weigh that? How do you measure the value of abstract good against concrete personal loss? It was a fair question, one I'd grappled with throughout my career. How do you quantify the prevention of a terrorist attack against missing your nephew's high school graduation? How do you balance saving lives against the inability to build lasting personal relationships? You don't, I admitted. You can't reduce it to a simple equation. You make your choices based on your values and your understanding of what the world needs from you, and then you live with the consequences. And you never regretted it? I was quiet for a long moment, watching boats move slowly up the river, their white wakes spreading behind them in perfect V's. I regretted the cost, I finally said. I regretted missing Marcus's childhood. I regretted the distance between us. I regretted your disappointment in me. But I never regretted the work itself. I never regretted serving. Vanessa reached over and took my hand, a gesture that surprised me with its warmth and familiarity. We hadn't been physically affectionate in years, our relationship too strained and complicated for such simple connections. I'm proud of you, she said simply. I should have said that years ago, even without knowing the full truth. I should have been proud of you for choosing to serve, for sticking with something difficult,
for being willing to sacrifice for something bigger than yourself. Her words hit me harder than I'd expected, and I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. I'd spent so many years being the strong one, the one who didn't need emotional validation or family approval, that I'd forgotten how much those things actually meant to me. "Thank you," I managed, my voice thick with emotion. "That means more than you know." We stood there for several minutes, watching the river and processing the enormous shift that had occurred in our relationship. Finally, Vanessa spoke again, her voice lighter now, tinged with something that might have been hope. "So what happens next? With us, I mean. With our family?" I thought about the question seriously, considering all the ways our dynamic would need to change now that the truth was partially out. "We start over," I said. "We build a relationship based on honesty instead of necessary deception. We figure out how to be sisters again." "I'd like that," she said softly. "I'd like that very much." As the reception began to wind down, Marcus rejoined us, his face flushed with excitement from celebrating with his classmates. "Are you ready to get out of here?" he asked. "I thought we might go somewhere quiet where we can really talk. I have about 1,000,000 questions, and I suspect you have some stories you can finally tell." I looked at my nephew, this young man who was about to begin his own journey into military service, and then at my sister, who was looking at me with genuine warmth for the first time in years. "I have some stories," I admitted, "and for the first time in 20 years, I'm actually allowed to tell them." We left Memorial Hall together, walking out into the warm afternoon air of a Maryland spring. The academy grounds were beautiful in the golden light, the historic buildings and manicured lawns creating a sense of timeless dignity and purpose. As we walked toward the parking area, Marcus peppered me with questions about my career, my assignments, the places I'd been, and the things I'd seen. For the first time, I was able to answer honestly, sharing stories that had been locked away in classified files for decades. I told them about tracking arms dealers through the back alleys of Eastern European capitals, about preventing terrorist attacks through careful intelligence work, about the network of analysts and field operatives who worked tirelessly to keep threats from reaching American shores. Vanessa listened with a mixture of fascination and horror, finally understanding the reality of the world I'd inhabited for so long. Marcus absorbed every detail with the intensity of someone who knew he might soon be walking a similar path. The hardest part, I explained as we reached my rental car, was always the coming home. Transitioning from that world of constant vigilance and high stakes to normal civilian life, even for brief visits. Learning to turn off the part of your brain that's always assessing threats, always looking for exits, always calculating risks. "Is that why you were always so quiet during family gatherings?" Vanessa asked. "So watchful?" "Partly," I admitted, but also because I was afraid I'd slip up, reveal something I shouldn't, compromise operational security.
It was safer to say nothing than to risk saying too much. We stood by the car for several more minutes, reluctant to end this conversation that felt like the beginning of something new and important. Finally, Marcus broke the comfortable silence. "Will you come to dinner tomorrow night?" he asked. "Mom's making her famous lasagna, and I want to hear more stories, the ones you can tell now that everything's different." I looked at Vanessa, who nodded encouragingly. "I'd love to have you," she said. "We have 20 years of dinners to make up for." As I drove away from the Naval Academy that evening, I found myself thinking about the strange turns life can take, the way a single moment of recognition can shift the entire trajectory of relationships that had been frozen in place for decades. The truth was finally out, or at least as much of it as could safely be revealed. My family knew who I really was, what I'd really been doing all those years when they thought I was wasting my potential in some meaningless military position. More importantly, they understood now that my absence from their lives hadn't been a choice born of indifference or selfishness, but a necessity born of love and duty. Every missed holiday, every declined invitation, every brief visit cut short by urgent deployment orders had been the price of keeping them safe in a dangerous world. The road ahead looked different now, brighter somehow. I had a new position waiting for me at the Naval War College, a chance to pass on everything I'd learned to the next generation of intelligence officers. I had a family that finally understood and appreciated my service rather than resenting it. Most importantly,
I had the opportunity to build real relationships with the people who mattered most to me, relationships based on truth rather than carefully constructed lies. As I drove through the Maryland countryside toward my hotel, I allowed myself to imagine what the future might hold. Sunday dinners with Vanessa's family, where I could actually participate in conversations rather than deflecting questions about my work. Birthday parties and graduations, where I could be fully present rather than mentally calculating exit strategies. Perhaps most exciting of all, I could be a real mentor to Marcus as he began his own naval career, sharing not just the romanticized stories of military service, but the real challenges, the difficult decisions, the personal costs that came with choosing duty over comfort. The phone on my passenger seat buzzed with a text message. I glanced down at the screen and saw it was from Marcus. "Thank you for today. Thank you for everything you've done that we never knew about. I'm proud to be your nephew." I pulled over at the next rest stop and typed back, "I'm proud to be your aunt. Always have been, always will be." As I sat there in the gathering dusk, I realized that this day marked not just the end of my covert career, but the beginning of something I'd never allowed myself to hope for. A chance to be part of my family's life without reservation, without secrets, without the constant weight of classified responsibilities. The revelation at Marcus's graduation ceremony had changed everything, but perhaps the most important change was the simplest one. For the first time in over 2 decades, I could go home and actually be home, not just visiting between assignments, but truly belonging to the place and people I'd been protecting all along. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new conversations, new opportunities to rebuild relationships that had been strained by necessity. But tonight, driving through the quiet countryside toward an uncertain but promising future, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. I felt free. 6 months later, I stood in my new office at the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island, watching the sunset over Narragansett Bay through tall windows that faced west toward the ocean. The office was everything I'd never allowed myself to dream of having. Spacious, well-appointed, with built-in bookshelves already filled with texts on intelligence theory, maritime strategy, and counterterrorism doctrine. On my desk sat a framed photograph that would have been impossible 6 months ago. Marcus in his ensign's uniform, flanked by Vanessa and me at his commissioning ceremony, all 3 of us smiling with genuine warmth. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. The weeks following Marcus's graduation had been filled with difficult conversations, careful explanations, and the slow, sometimes painful process of rebuilding trust that had been necessarily broken by the demands of my former life. But we'd made progress, real progress, in ways that still surprised me. My assistant knocked on the doorframe, interrupting my reflections. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Walsh was a brilliant officer who'd been assigned to help me transition into my new role as Director of Advanced Intelligence Studies. She'd proven invaluable in helping me navigate the academic bureaucracy of the War College, a world that operated by different rules than the covert operations I was used to. "Colonel Morrison, your 4 o'clock appointment is here," she said, "the prospective student interview." I nodded, straightening my uniform jacket. This was one of my favorite parts of the new job, interviewing candidates for our advanced intelligence program, identifying the next generation of officers who would carry forward the mission of protecting American interests around the world. "Send her in," I said. The young woman who entered my office moved with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to military discipline, but there was something else in her posture, a wariness that I recognized immediately. She was tall and lean, with dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun and intelligent eyes that took in every detail of the room before focusing on me. "Lieutenant Rebecca Torres reporting as requested, ma'am," she said, coming to attention. "At ease, Lieutenant," I replied, gesturing to the chairs arranged in front of my desk. "Please, have a seat. I've been looking forward to our conversation." As she settled into the chair, I reviewed her file one more time. Torres had graduated from the Naval Academy 3 years earlier, served with distinction aboard a destroyer in the Pacific Fleet, and was now seeking admission to our most selective intelligence program. Her academic record was impressive, her fitness reports were outstanding, and her commanding officers spoke of her in glowing terms. But what really caught my attention was reading between the lines of her personal history. Like me, she'd grown up in a family that didn't quite understand her choices,
that questioned her decision to pursue military service over more conventional paths. Her application essay had touched briefly on the challenges of maintaining family relationships while serving in positions that required discretion and frequent deployments. "Your file makes for interesting reading, Lieutenant," I began, settling back in my chair. "Outstanding academic performance, excellent leadership evaluations, and a clear aptitude for analytical work. But I'm more interested in what's not in your file. Tell me about your motivation for seeking advanced intelligence training." Torres was quiet for a moment, clearly considering her words carefully. When she spoke, her voice was steady but carried an undercurrent of something deeper. "Ma'am, I've spent the past 3 years serving in conventional roles, and while I found the work rewarding, I've always felt drawn to something more complex, more challenging. I want to be part of the missions that happen in the shadows, the work that prevents conflicts rather than fighting them after they've already started." It was a good answer, but it felt rehearsed. I leaned forward slightly, studying her expression. "That sounds like something you might say in any interview for any competitive program," I observed. "What I'm really asking is more personal. What drives you to seek out work that will require you to compartmentalize your life, to keep secrets from the people closest to you, to potentially spend years building relationships and cover identities that you might have to abandon at a moment's notice?" The question clearly caught her off guard, and for the first time since entering my office, her composure cracked slightly. She looked down at her hands, then back up at me with an expression that was suddenly much more vulnerable. "My family thinks I'm wasting my potential," she said quietly. "They think military service is something you do when you can't succeed in the real world. They see my deployments, my commitment to the Navy, as evidence that I'm running away from normal life rather than choosing to serve something bigger than myself." There it was, the familiar pain of being misunderstood by the people who were supposed to love and support you unconditionally. I saw in her face the same struggle I'd carried for 20 years, the weight of knowing your choices were right, even when everyone around you questioned them. "And how does that make you feel?" I asked. "Isolated," she admitted.
Like I'm living two completely different lives, one where I'm respected and valued for my capabilities, and another where I'm constantly defending my choices to people who will never understand them. I nodded, understanding completely. "Lieutenant, what I'm about to tell you isn't in any training manual, but it's the most important advice I can give you about intelligence work. The isolation you're describing now, it gets worse before it gets better. The work we do requires levels of secrecy that will strain every personal relationship you have. You'll miss birthdays, holidays, important family events. You'll have to lie to people you love about where you've been and what you've done. You'll carry the weight of knowledge that could destroy relationships if it were ever revealed." Torres listened intently, her face serious as she absorbed the reality I was describing. "But," I continued, "if you're willing to pay that price, if you're willing to sacrifice normal family relationships for the greater good, you'll be part of something extraordinary. You'll prevent terrorist attacks that the public will never know were planned. You'll gather intelligence that saves lives. You'll serve your country in ways that matter on a global scale." "Have you ever regretted it?" she asked, "making that choice?" I thought about the question seriously, considering everything that had led me to this moment. 6 months ago, I might have given a different answer, one colored by years of family dysfunction and personal isolation. But now, with the perspective that came from finally being able to share my truth, I could see the fuller picture. "I regretted the cost," I said honestly. "I regretted missing my nephew's childhood. I regretted the distance from my family. I regretted being misunderstood by the people who mattered most to me. But I never regretted the work itself. And in the end, the cost wasn't permanent. Truth has a way of surfacing when the time is right." Torres nodded slowly, clearly processing my words. "What changed? How did you move from being isolated from your family to—" She gestured toward the framed photograph on my desk. "This." I smiled, remembering the day that picture was taken. Marcus's commissioning ceremony had been much smaller than his graduation, a more intimate affair attended only by immediate family. But the pride on Vanessa's face as she watched her son receive his commission had been unmistakable, and for the first time in decades, that pride had extended to me as well. "The truth came out," I said simply.
Not all of it, not the classified details, but enough for my family to understand that my choices had been about service rather than selfishness. It took 20 years, but eventually they realized that my absence from their lives had been a sacrifice rather than a rejection. And they forgave you? There was nothing to forgive, I replied. They came to understand that I'd been protecting them all along, that every missed holiday and brief visit had been the price of keeping them safe in a dangerous world. Torres was quiet for several minutes, clearly weighing everything I'd shared with her. Finally, she looked up at me with determination in her eyes. "I want to do this work," she said firmly. "I want to serve in whatever capacity will make the biggest difference, even if it means years of personal sacrifice." I studied her face, seeing something of my younger self in her expression, the hunger for meaningful work, the willingness to pay personal costs for professional fulfillment, the desire to be part of something that mattered on a scale beyond individual comfort. "The program is demanding," I warned. 2 years of intensive training in cryptanalysis, threat assessment, cultural intelligence, and operational planning. If you're selected, you'll be studying alongside some of the brightest officers in the Navy, and you'll be held to the highest standards in everything you do." "I understand, ma'am." "You'll also be required to maintain absolute secrecy about your training and eventual assignments. Your family will know you're attending the Naval War College, but they won't know the specifics of your coursework or the nature of your future duties." Torres nodded again, her resolve unwavering. I made a note in her file, then looked back up at her with a slight smile. "Welcome to the program, Lieutenant. Classes begin in 3 weeks." The relief and excitement on her face reminded me of my own feelings when I'd first been selected for specialized training all those years ago. The sense of finally finding your place in the world, of being chosen for work that matched your capabilities and your values. After Torres left, I sat in my office as the last light faded from the sky, thinking about the conversation we'd had. In many ways, she was exactly where I'd been at her age, talented, driven, and willing to sacrifice personal comfort for professional purpose. But she was also entering a world that had evolved significantly since my early days in intelligence work. The threats were different now, more complex and multifaceted. The technology was more sophisticated, the operations more nuanced, but the core requirements remained the same: intelligence, dedication, and the willingness to serve something larger than yourself. My phone buzzed with a text message from Marcus, who was now stationed at a naval base in Virginia Beach, beginning his own career as a surface warfare officer. "Dinner this weekend?" the message read. "Mom's making her famous pot roast, and she specifically requested that you bring more stories." I smiled, typing back my acceptance. These family dinners had become a regular occurrence over the past few months, a chance for us to reconnect and for me to share carefully edited versions of my experiences with people who could finally appreciate them for what they were. The stories I told weren't the classified details of specific operations, but the broader themes of service and sacrifice, the challenges of working in difficult environments, the satisfaction of preventing threats before they could materialize. Vanessa listened with fascination, finally understanding the reality of the world I'd inhabited for so long, while Marcus absorbed every detail with the intensity of someone who knew he might soon be facing similar challenges. These dinners had become precious to me, a chance to experience the normal family relationships I'd never allowed myself to hope for. But they were also educational, helping Marcus understand the full scope of what military service could entail, preparing him for the choices he might face as his own career progressed. A knock on my office door interrupted my thoughts. Lieutenant Commander Walsh appeared in the doorway, carrying a thick folder marked with security classifications. "Colonel Morrison, the intelligence briefing materials for tomorrow's symposium just arrived from Washington. The Assistant Secretary of the Navy will be attending, along with representatives from Naval Intelligence and the Defense Intelligence Agency." I accepted the folder, noting its weight. Tomorrow's symposium was focused on emerging threats in the Asia-Pacific region, a topic that had become increasingly relevant as geopolitical tensions continued to evolve. As the Director of Advanced Intelligence Studies, I would be presenting our analysis of regional threat assessments and our recommendations for intelligence collection priorities. "Thank you, Sarah. I'll review these tonight and be ready for the morning session." After she left, I opened the folder and began reading through the briefing materials. The intelligence was sobering, painting a picture of a region where multiple powers were jockeying for position, where traditional alliances were being tested, and where new technologies were changing the nature of both threats and opportunities.
This was the world that officers like Torres would be entering, a complex landscape where success would depend on understanding not just military capabilities, but cultural nuances, economic factors, and the intricate web of relationships that defined modern international relations. As I reviewed the materials, I found myself thinking about the responsibility I now carried as an educator and mentor. The officers I was training would be making decisions that could affect global stability, gathering intelligence that could prevent conflicts, or shape American policy for decades to come. It was a weighty responsibility, but also an incredibly fulfilling one. For the first time in my career, I could see the direct impact of my work, could watch young officers develop from promising candidates into skilled intelligence professionals. My personal phone rang, interrupting my review of the briefing materials. The caller ID showed Vanessa's name, and I answered immediately. "Celeste, I hope I'm not interrupting anything important," she said, her voice warm with the affection that had replaced the years of subtle hostility. "Never," I replied. "What's going on?" "I was just thinking about our conversation last weekend, about the teaching position and how different your life is now, and I wanted to tell you something I should have said years ago." I waited, curious about what had prompted this call. "I'm proud of you," she continued, "not just for the classified work you did, not just for the recognition you received, but for the choice you made to serve in the first place. Even when I didn't understand it, even when I criticized it, you stuck with something you believed in. That takes courage I'm not sure I would have had." Her words hit me with unexpected force, validating something I'd needed to hear for decades. "Thank you," I managed. "That means more than you know." I also wanted to apologize, really apologize, for all the times I made you feel like your choices were wrong. I was so focused on what I thought your life should look like that I couldn't see the value in what you were actually doing. "You don't need to apologize," I said gently. "You were exactly as supportive as you could be given what you knew. And your criticism, as painful as it was, helped maintain my cover. In a strange way, your disapproval protected both of us." We talked for several more minutes, covering topics that ranged from Marcus's progress in his new assignment to plans for the upcoming holidays. When we finally hung up, I felt the familiar warmth that these conversations now brought, the satisfaction of a relationship that had been rebuilt on a foundation of truth and mutual respect. I returned to the briefing materials, but my mind kept drifting to the broader themes of service and sacrifice, of the choices we make and the prices we pay for them. The work I'd done over the past 20 years had required me to live a divided life, to maintain carefully constructed barriers between my professional and personal worlds. But now, in this new role, I could finally integrate those different aspects of myself. I could be both the experienced intelligence officer and the family member, the decorated veteran and the mentor to the next generation. The symposium the next day went well, with productive discussions about threat assessment methodologies and intelligence collection priorities. The Assistant Secretary of the Navy complimented our program's approach to training, noting that our graduates were consistently among the most effective intelligence officers in the fleet. During the lunch break, I found myself in conversation with Rear Admiral Patricia Henderson, the Director of Naval Intelligence. She was a contemporary of mine, someone who'd chosen a different path through the intelligence community, but had faced many of the same challenges I had. "I've been following your transition from fieldwork to education," she said, as we walked through the War College's historic campus. "It's not easy, moving from operations to teaching. How are you finding the adjustment?" "Surprisingly fulfilling," I admitted. "I thought I would miss the adrenaline of fieldwork, the immediate impact of operational success. But there's something deeply satisfying about shaping the next generation of officers, about knowing that the knowledge I gained over 20 years in the field will continue to serve the nation through the people I teach." Admiral Henderson nodded thoughtfully. "That's the real measure of a successful intelligence career, isn't it? Not just what you accomplish personally, but how effectively you pass on your expertise to others." Her words resonated with me as I considered my own legacy.
The operations I'd conducted, the threats I'd helped neutralize, the intelligence I'd gathered, all of that was important, but it was finite. The officers I was now training would multiply that impact exponentially, carrying forward the lessons I'd learned and applying them to challenges I couldn't even imagine. As the symposium concluded and the various officials returned to Washington, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction with the direction my life had taken. The transition from covert operations to academic leadership had been challenging, requiring me to develop new skills and adapt to a different kind of responsibility, but it had also given me something I'd never expected to have: the ability to serve my country while maintaining meaningful personal relationships, to use my expertise in a way that was both impactful and sustainable. That evening, I drove to Vanessa's house for our weekly family dinner, arriving to find Marcus already there, still in his uniform but looking relaxed and happy. The three of us spent the evening around her dining room table, sharing stories and laughter in a way that would have been impossible just months earlier. As I prepared to leave, Marcus walked me to my car, his expression thoughtful. "Aunt Celeste," he said, "I wanted to thank you for everything you've taught me about service, about the real cost of protecting something bigger than yourself." "You don't need to thank me," I replied. "You're finding your own path, making your own choices about how to serve." "But your example matters," he insisted. "Knowing what you sacrificed, understanding the real nature of the work you did, it helps me appreciate what I'm part of now. It makes the difficult aspects of military life feel worthwhile." As I drove home that night, I reflected on the strange turns life can take, the way a single moment of recognition can transform relationships that have been frozen in place for decades. The revelation at Marcus's graduation ceremony had changed everything, but perhaps the most important change was the simplest one. For the first time in over 20 years, I could be completely myself with the people who mattered most to me. I could share my passion for the work, my pride in my service, my hopes for the future without reservation or fear of compromising operational security. The road ahead looked bright with possibility. I had meaningful work that utilized all my experience and expertise. I had a family that finally understood and appreciated my choices. Most importantly, I had the opportunity to shape the next generation of intelligence officers, to ensure that the lessons I'd learned through decades of service would continue to protect American interests around the world. The young woman I'd interviewed that afternoon, Lieutenant Torres, represented that future. She and others like her would face threats I couldn't imagine, would serve in ways that hadn't been invented yet, would make sacrifices that would probably never be fully understood by their own families. But they would also experience the deep satisfaction that comes from serving something larger than yourself, from knowing that your work matters on a scale that extends far beyond individual recognition or reward. As I pulled into my driveway, I looked up at the stars visible above Newport, thinking about all the places those same stars had shone on me during my years of service. From the mountains of Afghanistan to the back alleys of Eastern European capitals, from the deserts of North Africa to the conference rooms of NATO headquarters, I'd carried with me the knowledge that I was serving something worth the sacrifice. Now, in this new chapter of my life, I could finally share that knowledge openly, could pass on the lessons of those years to others who would carry the mission forward. The truth had set me free, not just from the burden of maintaining cover stories and compartmentalized lives, but from the isolation that had been the hardest part of my service. I was no longer alone with my experiences, no longer carrying the weight of classified knowledge without anyone to share it with. I had found my way home, not just to a place, to a life where all the different aspects of myself could finally coexist in harmony. It had taken 22 years, but I was finally exactly where I belonged. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.